Meanwhile, Uganda has lost its only international airport that it had to China.
China is steadily removing the United States from Africa, not just through economic investments, but also through a broader strategy involving politics, diplomacy, military cooperation, and control over critical resources. This power shift is shaping a new global order because China is making Africa a key battleground for influence over the USA. While China is rising as a dominant player, the United States is losing ground due to its outdated strategies and inability to adapt to Africa's changing priorities. This transformation is about much more than just two countries. It involves other global powers like Russia, Iran, and European countries. Recently, the USA has retreated from a few African regions. But on the other hand, China and Russia are expanding their influence as the United States retreats. China has rapidly increased its military presence on the continent through arms sales, training programs, and the development of military technologies like surveillance systems. Between 2017 and 2020, China's arms exports to sub-Saharan Africa were nearly 3 times higher than those of the United States. From 2010 to 2021, total arms exports to the region reached $9.32 billion, with Russia accounting for $2.24 billion, China for $2.04 billion, and the US for only $473 million. This is how African countries are importing arms from China and Russia rather than the USA. According to a DF magazine, by 2024, China supplied more weapons to Africa than Russia and became the largest supplier of weapons to sub-Saharan Africa. These weapons include advanced drones, cybersecurity tools, and armored vehicles that have significantly bolstered the defense capabilities of African nations such as Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan. China's military engagement goes beyond arms sales. It provides training programs for African forces. For example, countries like Nigeria and Sudan have received Chinese drones and missile systems under agreements that also include officer training and maintenance support. Additionally, Chinese companies have built surveillance systems for African governments, further integrating Beijing into the security infrastructure of these nations. While China strengthens its foothold in Africa, the United States has been reducing its military presence. Over recent years, the US has closed key bases in Niger, Chad, and Mali due to shifting priorities and political instability in the region. For instance, in 2024, the US abandoned its over $100 million Air Base 201 in Agadez, Niger. It was a critical hub for counterterrorism operations and intelligence gathering in the Sahel region. This withdrawal created a power vacuum that Russian forces quickly filled. By May 2024, Russian military had moved into Niger's air bases to provide military training and equipment under agreements with the country's new junta government. The loss of these bases of the US military is not just a logistical setback, but also a symbolic blow to Washington's ambitions to maintain influence in Africa. The US retreat from Africa has weakened its ability to maintain influence on the continent. In contrast, China and Russia are capitalizing on this power vacuum to deepen their partnerships with African nations. Russia has expanded its military cooperation across sub-Saharan Africa by sending personnel and equipment to countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger while negotiating for naval bases in strategic locations like Libya. This growing presence by both China and Russia not only challenges US dominance, but also reshapes Africa's geopolitical landscape in favor of these emerging powers. This strategy has made Russia more popular than the United States in many parts of Africa. In Mali, surveys show that the majority of the population holds a positive view of Russia in Africa. This popularity stems from Russia's approach of providing direct military assistance without attaching political conditions or governance requirements like the USA. The growing Russian influence aligns with Chinese interests in Africa, as both nations have established a strategic partnership aimed at counterbalancing Western influence in the region. Their cooperation extends across diplomatic, economic, and security domains, though each country maintains its distinct approach to engagement with African nations. At the same time, other countries like the European Union, EU, and Middle Eastern nations are also trying to expand their influence in Africa. The EU focuses on funding development projects but cannot match China's massive investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Middle Eastern countries like Turkey and the UAE are concentrating on specific areas such as agriculture and renewable energy. The US declining presence in Africa comes at a time when its competitors are expanding their influence. This shift has left Washington struggling to find new partners in Africa while facing growing anti-Western sentiment across the continent. The loss of these partnerships is a major setback for the United States' ability to access critical resources like cobalt and lithium minerals essential for modern technology. As African nations increasingly turn to alternative allies who offer support without governance demands, the United States finds itself sidelined in a region that is becoming ever more important in global geopolitics. Diplomatically, China has cultivated stronger and more consistent relationships with African leaders compared to the United States. This was evident at the 2024 China-Africa Summit in Beijing, where over 50 African leaders and heads of state gathered, and it was one of the largest diplomatic events hosted by China in recent years. During the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged increased investments, aid and partnerships in areas such as infrastructure, energy, and education. Xi Jinping also emphasized China's policy of non-interference, which avoids imposing political conditions on its support. This approach has made China an attractive partner for many African nations that often feel constrained by Western aid tied to requirements like governance reforms or human rights improvements. He noted that China has contributed significantly to Africa's development by building roads, railways, schools, and hospitals, which have transformed lives across the continent. This hands-off approach resonates with many African leaders. For instance, Kenya's President William Ruto praised China's model for treating African nations as equal partners rather than subjects of foreign policy experiments. In contrast, the United States has taken a different approach in its engagement with Africa. US policies often focus on promoting governance reforms and addressing human rights issues. While these are important goals, they can sometimes alienate African leaders who feel they are being lectured rather than supported. For example, during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2022, the US committed $55 billion to various initiatives across the continent, but emphasized partnerships that prioritize democratic values and transparency. This approach contrasts sharply with China's non-conditional aid model, which many African governments find more accommodating to their immediate developmental needs. At the same time, economically, China is also advancing in Africa's regions. China's growing economic role in Africa is a clear sign of how global partnerships are changing. In 2023, trade between China and Africa reached $282 billion, setting a new record. This made China Africa's biggest trading partner for the 15th year. China's strategy in Africa is focused on big infrastructure projects that meet immediate needs, such as roads, railways, and power plants. A good example is the $3.6 billion standard gauge railway in Kenya, which connects key cities like Mombasa and Nairobi, cutting travel times and boosting trade. This project has helped Kenya's economy grow, but has also raised concerns about debt and environmental impacts. On the other hand, the United States has struggled to match China's influence in Africa. The United States' trade is much smaller, with exports to Africa totaling just $28.69 billion in 2023 compared to China's $282 billion. The United States often provides aid tied to conditions like improving democracy or fighting corruption, which are important but do not always address Africa's urgent needs for jobs, infrastructure, and trade opportunities. China's approach aligns more closely with what many African countries prioritize: fast development and economic growth. China's growing economic dominance in Africa is closely tied to its control over the continent's vast natural resources, which are critical for modern technologies like electric vehicles and batteries. Africa holds about 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements essential for clean energy and high-tech industries. Chinese companies dominate the mining sector. They own or have stakes in nearly all major cobalt-producing mines in the country. For example, Chinese firms control 15 out of 19 cobalt mines in the Congo, and more than half of the country's cobalt output is refined in China before being sold to global battery manufacturers. China's strategy to secure these resources is part of its broader Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which combines infrastructure investments with resource extraction. Between 2013 and 2023, Chinese companies signed contracts worth over $700 billion in Africa under the BRI framework. Meanwhile, the United States has struggled to match China's influence in Africa's critical minerals sector. Although US policymakers have recently emphasized diversifying supply chains and reducing reliance on China, their efforts lag far behind Beijing's decades-long strategy. For example, the US, Congo, and Zambia signed a memorandum of understanding to develop a supply chain for electric vehicle batteries in late 2022. The USA administration has also launched programs like the Mineral Security Partnership to encourage Western investment in African minerals, but faces challenges due to China's entrenched position. By securing access to Africa's critical resources, China is not only helping African nations modernize through infrastructure development, but also strengthening its position as a global leader in technology and industry. Africa's role in this changing world is huge. With its vast natural resources, growing population, and strategic location, it is becoming a key player in global politics. By building strong ties with African nations through investments and partnerships, China is not only boosting its own position, but also changing how global powers interact with developing regions. Do you think the United States will be completely pushed out of Africa by China's growing influence? Or is there still a chance for a comeback? Share your opinions in the comments below. I will read each of your comments and feature one of the best comments in our channel along with your name. If you like unfiltered and unbiased videos, hit the subscribe button